Hello, I'm Jake Kelly. Welcome to my channel. Welcome also to the world of reloading. This video is for those with no real knowledge of that world but are intrigued by the base concept. Ammunition consists of just four main parts: a case, a primer, powder, and a bullet. It's a fairly straightforward process to assemble them together to produce your own ready-to-fire cartridges. But wait, gunpowder burning at a rapid rate in a constrained environment can produce explosive results. How can we do that safely? Why do we really want to do it at all? Well, let me address the second part of that question first. Why do we want to do this? Well, there are four main reasons. First, you can save money. In decades past, you could make ammo for less than half the price being charged in stores. If you shoot less than a box a year, that doesn't really matter. But if you shoot thousands of rounds a year in competition, that difference can pay for the required equipment in the first year, and from then on, you're just contributing to a new gun fund. Today's prices are closer together, but the component route still is cheaper. Next, availability. There have been times when factory ammo was scarce, and if it could be found, it was overpriced. But components were normally available. If one brand of powder was out of stock, there was usually something else on the shelf. The same thing applied to bullets. Primers did tend to be more critical, but there were options there as well, and there are even more options today. Fine-tuning. Factory ammo normally comes with bullet weight and speed data, but that's about it. You have no idea what powder or primer is being used, or even the bullet's manufacturer or its diameter. For the person that enjoys a day at the range a couple times a year, again, that doesn't matter. But for a competitor or a hunter, it may. Tuning your ammo affects felt recoil, target impact effectiveness, and accuracy. Finally, it can be a great hobby. If you're involved in shooting sports or as a hunter, it's something that you can do that's kind of related to those activities and can be fun on its own. Components. Now it's time to explore the four basic components that I mentioned before. First up, cartridge cases. Start saving your empty brass right now, right away. If you have any thoughts of getting into the reload game, start saving your empty brass. You can always purchase empty brass, but why do that? Semi-auto pistol brass rarely wears out. It can be used over and over and over again. Build up a supply. Next, choosing bullets and powder. That can be a little tricky. You need to find the right combination for your use. Your use as a hunter looking for deer versus somebody that's into bullseye shooting versus somebody that's into pistol action shooting. All those are different requirements, and you need to find the right combination for your use and your gun. There are many, many alternatives to consider. But before we get into that, let's discuss safety. Gunpowder laying on the ground that's lit by a match just kind of sizzles and smokes. It does not explode. However, in a constrained environment, the pressure that's given off by its burning rapidly builds and builds and pushes in all directions hard. And that's what causes the explosive effect that pushes a bullet out of the case and down the barrel at, say, 1,000 feet per second. Sounds scary, but the maximum danger is once the bullet has been tightly fitted into the case that contains the primer and powder. And basically at that point, reloads and factory ammo are equal. Now, I don't really want to minimize this. Gunpowder and primers, as well as completed ammunition, should be treated and stored with respect. But gunpowder and primers that are stored in original containers in a cool and non-constrained environment are not really something to be feared. What can be dangerous is the combining of the components in a manner that causes a produced round to be outside of safety specifications, and then firing it can cause catastrophic results. Do you know how much powder to put in a cartridge case? Some powders burn faster or slower than others. Does this affect the amount that's needed? Are the individual chunks of powder pellets or are they flakes? Does that matter? What about the bullet weight and shape? How far the bullet is inserted into the case? What effect do these factors have? If you don't really have a grasp on these concepts, don't worry. Neither do I, and I've safely loaded and fired over 100,000 rounds of ammunition. Scientists have done all of this work for us. So, get a book. They detail what combinations are safe. This is Modern Reloading, 2nd edition by Richard Lee. It was printed back in 2004, and some of the information is in fact dated. But it does provide in the first third a good background perspective on the concept of reloading. What's really important are the powder company supplied recipes that make up the last 2/3 of the manual. It's a comprehensive list. Starts with the 17 Ackley B, whatever that is, and ends with the 50 caliber Browning. Other reloading manufacturers offer similar books. Powder companies provide load data on their websites. The critical work has been done. We just need to follow their directions. Before I get into how to use this data, it's important to review a couple of important safety points. You are responsible for the safety of your reloads and should always use the starting loads. Number 2, work up to the never exceed loads in small increments and do not exceed those limits. Do not smoke while reloading. And unfortunately, be aware the use of reloaded ammunition may void some of gun warranties. So how do we use the provided data? Well, I'm going to use 9mm as an example because 9mm Luger is the most popular semi-auto caliber in use today, and that is my primary area of experience. The base concepts apply to shotgun and rifles as well, but I'll leave the details concerning those areas to those more qualified. Load data in these books is listed first by bullet weight, then by bullet type. Each type is then further broken down by powder. Now 9mm starts with 88 grain bullets and goes up to 150 grains. That's a pretty big range. So first we have to choose the bullet, basically the bullet weight. Ask others what they use, or see what comes in most factory loads, and check for component availability. Check out load data for hints. For example, the Lee book has 29 different powder recipes for 115 grain jacketed bullets, but only 3 for 115 grain lead bullets. That's a clue right there. The 124 and 147 grain bullets are popular 9mm choices as well, but factory loads are more often 115 grain than anything else, so I'm going to stick with that for now. So we've chosen the bullet weight, 115 grain. Next, what type? Not lead unless you're participating in cowboy action where that's required. So our choices are jacketed, plated, or coated. Jacketed ammo starts with a lead projectile, as they all do, and then has a copper jacket wrapped around it and completely covers the lead core. This is commonly referred to as FMJ, full metal jacket. They are usually the most expensive, but not always by a big margin. Plating takes the lead core and electrically bonds a copper plating to the surface. It's thinner than a copper jacket and is a bit less expensive. Polymer-coated bullets are a newer technology and cheaper still. They do not appear in many older load data lists. If you're going to use them, you should check with the manufacturer before use. I'm going to assume jacketed for now, as that's the most commonly found. Next, powder. So many choices. If you can, talk to others that are doing what you do, whether that's hunting or shooting sports. Find out what works best for them. Or take your load data to the gun store and see what's available on their shelf. Since you're just starting out, a pound of powder is likely to be the least expensive component you're going to buy. As long as you have load data for the powder and the price is reasonable, I wouldn't get overly concerned at this point. Part of the fun is exploring alternatives and fine-tuning what works best for you. Speaking of lists, note that there are some powders, like my favorite, CFE pistol, that aren't listed. They were developed after those lists were created. Check the powder company's website for load data if the can says that it can be used for pistol loads. These are 3 popular powder recipes for 115 grain jacketed bullets using Winchester 231, Tight Group, and Bullseye. Winchester 231. The starting load is just 4.3 grains. Now, it may be obvious to most, but for those totally new to reloading, grains are a weight measurement. You are not counting specks of powder. You will need a scale of some sort, either a balance beam or electronic, that can measure grains in this range. Now, the Lee book references pre-measured dipper cups, But that's really associated with loading individual cases one at a time. Most reloaders use some other method incorporated into their press. Once it's adjusted, it drops the same amount of powder into each case. Overall length. We've been focused on the powder and its weight within a prescribed range. Minimum overall length is also important since case and bullet are not changing lengths. Adjusting the seated depth of the bullet adjusts the size of the combustion chamber between the primer and the base of the bullet. This has a direct effect on the resulting pressure. The minimum length specified must be maintained. Going to need calipers or something to be able to check that. Power factor. Shooting sports frequently require minimum power for the ammunition used in their sport. For IDPA, the number most often is 125. It is calculated by multiplying the weight of the bullet times the speed divided by 1,000, and then dropping the decimals. A 115 grain bullet traveling at 1,010 feet per second would yield a power factor of 116. So, a 115 grain jacketed bullet over 4.3 grains of Winchester 231 would fail this test. However, as you approach the not to exceed value of 4.8, it would pass. Determining the amount of powder that works best in your gun and that meets the sport's requirements are all part of the fine-tuning that I mentioned before. Let's reverse the power factor formula, multiplying the 125 needed by 1,000 and then divide by the 115 grain weight of our bullet. We find that 1,087 feet per second is the minimum speed required. Looking again at the above data, that would be somewhere in the middle of the Winchester 231 range, but below the starting point for both tight group and bullseye. Note that bullseye does not provide a range for tuning our gun in actual use, but tight group does. While all three of the powders are okay to use, if all three are available, I would choose tight group, as it provides the most flexibility. Let me just stop and explain what I would do if I were developing loads, and I'm going to assume that I'm going to use tight group here. Since 4.5 grains of tight group should produce 1,135 feet per second, that would give me the power factor that I needed sufficient for participation in IDPA. So what I would do is I would prepare 10 cartridges with 4.5 grains of powder with a bullet set to a minimum overall length of 1.125. Then what I would do is try to produce another 10, let's say at 4.6 grains, and then another 10 at 4.8 grains. I do not want to exceed the maximum shown in the chart of 4.8. So I want to have 10 at 4.5, 10 at 4.6 and 10 at 4.8. Now, when you're adjusting powder in your press that fine, it may not be exactly on. So if I have 10 at 4.5 and 10 at 4.6, that's fine. Maybe the next 10 is at 4.7 that's fine. What I want to be able to do is go to the range and shoot 5 shots of type 1, 5 shots at type 2, 5 shots at type 3. Then repeat, type 1, type 2, type 3. And that way I can see if the difference in grains feels different to me, felt recoil, and also if it affects accuracy. One last point. Don't try this at 10 yards. 10 yards, everything's going to group really tight, no matter what you do. Go out at 15, even better, 20 yards. At 20 yards, you're going to have the group opening up a little bit. Even if you're a good shooter, that's going to happen. Don't adjust your point of aim. Use the same point of aim. We don't really care about the accuracy just yet. What we want to get is the tightest group possible. Once we have a really tight group that's shooting in your gun, and we're going to continue to use that ammo, then I would adjust the gun sights to bring that into center of the target. 30 rounds, you're going to find that one recipe works better for you than the other two do. This is all part of the fine-tuning that we've discussed earlier in the presentation. Finally, primers. There are 4 sizes: small pistol, large pistol, small rifle, large rifle. They can either come as standard or magnum. The Lee manual says to use standard primers for all powders except Winchester 296. When primers were scarce, I did use Magnum small pistol primers with a number of different powders, and I never noticed any difference. I would use standard primers if they're available, but personally would not hesitate to use Magnum primers if that's what was on the shelf. Your call. Size. 9mm cartridges take small pistol primers, as do .38 Special and most other rounds starting with a 3, like .380 or .357 mag. 44 Special, 45 ACP, and 10mm all take large pistol primers, but some 45 ACP cases do take the smaller size, just to confuse us. My suggestion is to start with a single caliber, what you use most, and keep things simple. Brands. A primer is simply a metal cup with a metal anvil inside and some explosive material separating the two. When it's struck, the blow crushes the material between the two layers, causing it to pop, which ignites the powder. CCI has some fairly hard cases. Federals are much softer. Winchesters are between the two. If your gun is stock, any brand is probably fine. But if you have a lightened hammer or striker spring, you may not have enough force to dependably set off CCI primers. I also avoid S&B cases and primers. The sockets on their brass is just a tiny bit small, which sometimes causes reloading issues. Personally, I like Federals and Winchesters as reliable backup. Equipment. So what do you need? This can be intimidating at first, as with any new venture. Go to the Dillon Precision website and order a catalog. Blue Press. It's all in there. Another source is powdervalley.com. An excellent place for powder, primers, and reloading equipment. But for now, let's just talk through the process and see what would be required. Tumbler and media. You need to be able to clean the cases. What I'm showing you here is from Lyman, both their tumbler and the media. Frankfurt Arsenal also makes sturdy but inexpensive equipment. All this can be purchased at Midway, Brownells, or stores like Cabela's. Kits are sometimes cheaper than buying individual components. Crushed corncob media is the cheapest, with crushed walnuts the next step up. Add a bottle of cartridge polish, but use polish that's made for this purpose. Do not use Brasso, as it will weaken the cases. Grab some case lube at the same time. Now, some folks do clean with stainless steel pins, but I've not actually done that. I also never wash the cases, as I'm not sure I'd get all the water out. Never dry them in the oven, as that may damage the brass. Next, I want to show you how all these pieces come together. First, you take your tumbler, add media, add it up about halfway, maybe a little bit more. Add a shot or two of cartridge polish, and you have to do that maybe every second or third time. You don't need to do it every time. Once you've done that, put the top on, run it down tight, and turn it on for just a minute or two. Makes a lot of noise. It's good to do that in the other room while you can shut the door behind you. Anyway, the other thing I've noticed is that while it's making noise, you can adjust the tightness of the lid, and that will affect the amount of noise that it makes. I'll come back to that. Anyway, after you've run that for a while so that the polish has a chance to mix in with the media and won't be there in clumps, take the lid off and dump in some cartridges. Level it out a little bit so you've got a level of the media. Dump in, I don't know, 50, 80, 100 cartridges. Put your top back on. Run the clamp down into place and turn it back on. Notice it's a little bit quieter. It's quieter because it's got more volume in there. It also can get quieter if I tighten down the top so that there's less to vibrate. But you're not going to get away from the noise completely because it is vibrating. Also, even though it has rubber feet underneath the device, this will have a tendency to mark any table that you have it sitting on. So you always want to put some kind of pad underneath so that it won't mark won't mar the surface. I normally let my tumbler run for a half hour, 40 minutes. Some people do it for longer than that, an hour or 2 hours. But remember, you don't need to get the cases shiny. What you need to get them is relatively clean. A little bit of soot marking is not going to hurt the cartridges or the reloading process. Half hour, 45 minutes is fine. Your tumbler will last years longer as a result. A separator is kind of a neat tool. It helps remove clean cases from the media. Dylan sells a nice bin with a rotating squirrel cage for about 88 bucks. But you could just empty the tumbler into a tray and then pick out the cases one by one. That'll work too. Now, to show you how it works, you just open the squirrel cage, take the tumbler, dump everything into the squirrel cage, put the tumbler off to the side, close the lid, and then turn the crank. As you turn the crank, the media itself will drop out of the slots, leaving the cases behind. When that's done, open the squirrel cage, and your cases have been cleaned and separated from the media. Dump the cases into a tray. I'm using an old oil pan from my automotive fixing days. Put the squirrel cage to one side. And now you're ready to go through the cases. I always check the cases one by one. First of all, I found that S&B cases have a small socket, a small primer socket, just a tiny bit smaller than normal, but it sometimes causes reloading problems. So any S&B case, I immediately discard. The other thing I found that some cases have, it's an imprint of a circle with an X inside it. I'm not sure what that means, but I found that they caused me trouble from time to time in the reloading process, so I discard them as well. But you can also take the opportunity to look at the case just quickly and just do a quick check to see if there's anything split, misshapen. Check the base, take a quick look, check the base, check the quick look. Just take a quick look quality control wise, so that you know when the cases go to the next step in the reloading process, you're dealing with good, clean, even though they're used cases. A press. A Lee single stage press starts at under $100. Progressive presses under $300. You have to resize and deprime the spent cartridge case, prime the case, load the powder, insert the bullet to the correct depth, and then crimp the case neck around the bullet to hold it in place. Single-stage presses require changing tool dies for each operation. With a progressive press, each station on the press performs one of those functions. After 3 or 4 pulls, a loaded round is completed with each pull of the lever. Really kind of neat. My suggestion? Consider a single-stage press from Lee or one of the other manufacturers only if you're planning to load very small volumes. Otherwise, a progressive press is the way to go. Now, Lee does make reasonable entry-level equipment, as do RCBS and others. But if you expect to be loading in the thousands instead of hundreds, I recommend Dillon. Their presses are more expensive, but they're built like a tank. They have great customer service, and if any part breaks on their press, it's guaranteed forever. Free replacement, even if you're not the original owner. I'm going to demonstrate these concepts using a Lee Auto Prime and a Dillon Square Deal B. Now, the Lee is not an actual press, but it is similar in operation to some single-stage presses, and does perform one of the needed functions, priming the empty cartridge cases. You can load a box of primers into this area here, and gravity will feed them one at a time into place as you use the tool. It comes with different inserts that you place in this area here to accommodate different calibers. Once you have the correct insert installed, in the primers loaded in the feed box, you then just take the empty cartridge case with the empty socket, slide it into the insert, and then press like you're working a pair of pliers. And at that point, we now have inserted a primer into the case. I'll take my next case, insert that, press, and that now has a new primer loaded. And again, I'm using dead primers here, no live ammunition. Okay, so one at a time, you can load primers into the cartridge cases. Normally with a single stage press, what you would do is run a batch of cases through each step one at a time. So you would size and deprime the cases, maybe a box of 50 or maybe a box of 100. Put the cases off to one side. Then you would come back and you would prime the cases. Put them off to one side. They actually make trays that you can purchase so that you line them up vertically like this, and then you would fill each case with the proper amount of powder using a dipper cup or some other device to put in the correct amount of powder. Then you would insert the bullet and then press the bullet to the proper length and then crimp the neck around the top of the case. Each of those steps is a different operation. Each one would require a different tool or a different die in the tool. In some cases, it would be a handheld tool like the Lee Auto Prime. In some cases, it might be a bench-mounted tool. But again, even though you'd be operating it mounted to a bench, you would perform one operation on all of the cases and then change the die in the tool to perform the second operation. This is a Dillon Square Deal B. It is an entry-level progressive press from Dillon and is unique in a couple of ways. It's designed for pistol cartridges only and uses proprietary dies. Most presses use universal dies, as do the other Dillon offerings. However, each Square Deal leaves the factory with a set of dies of one caliber, already installed and adjusted. Other die sets are available at a reasonable price if you wish to reload multiple calibers. This is the first station. You slide a case into position and then pull the lever down. As you do so, it raises the case and runs it up through the sizing die located here and restores it to the correct external dimensions. At the same time, it forces a metal pin through the primer socket, depriming the case. As you bring the lever back up, notice the case rotates to position 2, where it is then pressed down onto a primer. You can't really make it out on the camera, but there's a primer already picked up from the tube sitting ready in station 2. So that when the cartridge, which has now been deprimed and resized, comes back, you'll see that it rotates into position, and then when you push the lever all the way home, it then presses the primer into the socket. So now we have a new primer loaded into the socket, ready to go. We take a fresh, empty case, insert it in position 1, and we're ready to go to the next step. We bring the lever down. The cartridge case in position 2 goes up into the powder seating die, and there it opens up the neck of the case so that it can better accept the bullet, and it drops a predetermined amount of powder into the case. When we bring it down, it advances that case to position 3, and it rotates the empty case now into position 2, where it seats the primer in that case. I insert another empty case in position 1. I then take a bullet and insert it into the case at station number 3. Some presses have an automatic bullet feeder. This one does not. When I lean forward to place the bullet into the top of the cartridge, the mouth of which has been opened slightly at position 2, I take an opportunity to glance inside just to make sure that the powder has dropped correctly. Kind of quality control. So at this point, I've placed the projectile into the mouth of the case and stabilized it in a vertical position. I've put an empty case in position 1. As I bring the lever down, the bullet goes up into the die, and I remove my fingers out of the way, take the lever all the way to the down position. At that point, we have resized and deprimed at position 1. We have opened the mouth and on the cartridge on position 2 and dropped the predetermined amount of powder into it. And we've pressed the bullet in position 3 down into the case at a predetermined level. When I bring the lever back home, everything rotates one position. So now the case with the bullet in it has moved to position 4, where it is ready for the crimping operation to take place. The bullet is now seated to the correct depth in the case and now seated at station 4. We take an empty case and put it in position 1. And now, with the next press of the lever, the cartridge in the back at station 4 rises into the crimp die, which is located on the back. There, the neck is squeezed tight against the bullet to finish the process. And as we saw previously, the case in position 1 will be sized externally and deprimed. When we raise the lever to the home position, notice the completed cartridge is ejected from the press. This is then repeated with each cycle of the lever as long as components are in place. So I will put an empty cartridge case in position 1, and as I did before, I'll position a new bullet on top of the case in position 3, and as I crank the lever down once, it resizes and deprimes at position 1. It then drops the powder in position 2. It seats the bullet in position 3. It crimps the cartridge in position 4. And when I raise the lever home, a second completed cartridge is ejected from the press. And as I said before, this will continue as long as you feed components one pull down, one press up, one completed cartridge from the press. The beauty of a progressive press. Miscellaneous equipment. A scale, either balance beam or electronic, to check powder weight and grains. Calipers, dial or electronic, to measure cartridge overall length. Both are critical to make sure that your rounds are within safety specs. Storage boxes for your completed ammo. Flipper tray for easier primer manipulation. A logbook. Keep track of what works and what doesn't. Chronograph. Load data will help you estimate your speed so that you can estimate power factor. But for final check prior to a big match, a chronograph is really essential, especially if you're flirting with minimum power factors. Check with your match director. There may be one at the club that you can borrow so that you don't have to go out and purchase that on your own. In summary, this has been an introductory video. As I'm sure that you can imagine, there are many, many details left for you to discover. In summary, I'd just like to make 4 suggestions. Get good load data from a reputable source and stick to it. Single-stage presses are for low-volume production. Talk to others in your sport. Find out what works for them. And remember, safety first. Take your time. Pay attention to detail. Thanks for watching. Reload and shoot safe.